Good morning to all of you. It's great to be here with you today, and as I look around at the congregation, I see that we've got some young people here, and if you happen to be a parent of one of these young kids and you're trying to instill in them a good sense of personal hygiene and an appropriate sense of humor, you might not want to keep them in worship today. Just a warning. And that has nothing to do with anything I'm going to say. That has everything to do with what we see Jesus saying and doing in our gospel lesson today. I don't know, we may have some healthcare professionals here. Any healthcare professionals? A couple, maybe? Yeah, and if we have any health department workers, or maybe if you're like me and you're just a little bit persnickety about the cleanliness of things, and particularly the cleanliness of your kitchen. Nobody's like that, right? No. Okay, yes, one. I've got one. Well, if you fall into any of those categories, you may be finding yourself a little bit torn about this whole encounter between Jesus and the Pharisees. On the one hand, we want to be like, all right, Jesus, you show those Pharisees who's boss. And on the other hand, at least I'm a little bit like, okay, come on, Jesus. You're the God of the universe. You, above all people, should know that this whole business of washing your hands before you eat, and washing your food after you buy it, and washing your cooking utensils before you make a meal, actually not a bad idea. Especially in his day, when if you contracted a foodborne illness, it was not unlikely that you would die. But we can be reasonably certain that the scribes and the Pharisees, in their observance of all this ritual cleansing, were not at all concerned with cleanliness in the sanitation sense. And so if we allow ourselves to get stuck here, we may end up missing the whole point that Jesus is trying to make in this passage. Now, this confrontation starts because the Pharisees and the scribes, they come to Jesus and they're challenging his authority and his legitimacy as a religious leader, because they see him and his disciples failing to observe the ritual cleansing that was passed on by the elders. It was one of the traditions in Judaism. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were experts in the law of Moses. And not only were they experts, but they were scrupulous about following the law. And when I talk about the law of Moses, I'm not just talking about the Ten Commandments, which most of us would be familiar with, but actually, the law of Moses is this big umbrella. And under the umbrella is the Ten Commandments. And then there's a whole bunch of other commandments that are written in the same style as the Ten Commandments. And then we have a kind of law that is a case law, which more or less goes like, if this happens, then you do this. And it was to help address situations that may have arisen in the Israelite community. And also under this giant umbrella is something called the Holiness Code. And the Holiness Code is in the book of Leviticus, and I would say probably the average churchgoer may not have happened to read the book of Leviticus unless you were trying to find some material to put you to sleep at night. But the Holiness Code specifically dealt with laws about purity and ritual cleanliness. And so it talked about which foods, which people, which things you could touch and which things you could do, the things that were clean and the things that were unclean. And so all together, under that gigantic umbrella, there were 613 laws, 365 negative commandments, corresponding to the number of days in the year, and then 248 positive commandments, which at the time they believed to correspond to the number of bones and major organs in the human body. And so the scribes and the Pharisees had knowledge of every single one of these 613 commandments. And not just that, but on top of that, they had this whole body of oral traditions that had been passed on, including the ritual cleansing. And these had been handed down from the Jewish elders. And so essentially, the scribes and the Pharisees were overachievers. We don't know anybody like that. No. Yeah. Now, in response to their criticism, Jesus more or less tells them, you guys are missing the boat. And he takes a quote that they would have known because they were so well versed in the law and in the prophets, and he takes a verse from the prophet Isaiah, and he turns it back on them. And he says, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And essentially, what has happened is that in their diligent observance of the law, and in doing what they understood to be going above and beyond the law, they had mistaken the means for the end. And I'm going to go ahead and explain what I mean by that. The law was not given and was not meant to be an end in itself. There was actually a point to all of that business about what you could touch and eat and what you couldn't touch and eat and do and not do. Right in the middle of that holiness code in Leviticus, God gives them the reason. And God says, "You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have separated you from the other peoples to be mine." Does anyone know what the word holy actually means? Yeah, set apart. Thank you. Yeah, it means set apart, separate. Now, I'd like for us to look at something. I think we've got a map here. Yeah, a map of Judea. And this was in the time of Joshua. So right as the Israelites were preparing to enter the promised land that God had given them. And so you can see on this map all of the other people groups that were already inhabiting the land and also the border around where they were going to be moving in. And so we've got the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Moabites, tons of people. And all of these people worshiped other gods. And so, even though they drove a lot of these people out, they drove them mostly to the borders of where they were living. And God gave them the law because God knew that at some point or another, they would be tempted to become like other nations. And they'd forget the Lord and turn toward these other gods. And so, the law became a means of setting them apart from other people, with the end in mind that they would remember that they were different, that they were called to be set apart, and that their hearts were meant to belong to God and God alone. What did Jesus say in all this business about the law? What did Jesus say was the greatest commandment? He said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." And then he adds, and the second is like this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. All of those 613 commandments hung on these two commandments to love God and love your neighbors. Now, the law wasn't bad. And the traditions that had been passed on, they weren't bad. In fact, we've already seen that there were probably some really great health benefits to them. But the problem was that the scribes and the Pharisees had become so focused on carrying out these tasks and getting all these commandments right, that in the process, they had forgotten the greatest one, and that's to love God. On the outside, they were doing everything right and then some. But on the inside, Jesus says, your hearts are far from God. Do we have any task-oriented people here in the congregation? Oh, I hear the giggles. Yeah, task-oriented people. Any perfectionists? Oh, yeah. Okay, so I'm in good company. You know what? We would have made awesome Pharisees. I know, too bad it doesn't matter, but we've been really great at that. And even if you're not naturally task-oriented, just by virtue of being a part of a church, I think we are all at risk of getting our traditions or the means of practicing our faith confused with the end. One of the friends that I met through the church where I attended in Durham told me a story once about a church where she had previously been a member of the lay leadership. And in this church, it happened that there was a young woman from the youth group who took the pastor's message seriously one week and actually came back the next week having invited a number of her friends to church. And so before anyone knew it, there was about 10 high school students sitting in the front pews of the church. And they were coming and showing up to help with mission fundraisers. And for the very first time in their lives, they were hearing this message that there was a God who loved them unconditionally. And there was a God who had created them with a purpose and who had done absolutely everything to be in relationship with them. So do you know what happened to these young people? God changed their lives. And so that spring, when they came to the pastor requesting baptism, the pastor thought, well, what better time for them to be baptized and to celebrate their entrance into this new life in Christ than at Easter, when we celebrate the new life that Christ gives us through his victory over sin and his victory over death. So that was great. The young people were excited. And they were excited because that meant they would be able to invite their parents, and their parents could come to church. And also, they had one small request, and that was that they be baptized by immersion. And they wanted to do this because they wanted that visible, tangible reminder of this departure from their old life and this entrance into the new. And so the pastor said, okay, there's a pond outside the church, no big deal. Well, you think no big deal, but this church had some traditions. And on Easter, the word started getting around that they were going to be having these baptisms on Easter. And there was a murmur, and people started saying, how can we have these baptisms on Easter? They're going to ruin it. They're going to drag in that dirty, muddy water into the sanctuary. And so then they said, okay, well, we can fix that. We're going to put some drop cloths down. And then, oh, no, that was bad because that just made the sanctuary ugly. And then they had the other tradition of actually every year on Easter and on Christmas only of bringing in their handbell choir. And I don't know if you guys have participated in handbells, but it actually takes a lot of work to get a handbell choir together and to rehearse a handbell choir. And so because they were a relatively small church, they only really were able to do that twice a year. And so someone actually went to the lay leader and said, we have handbells at Easter, not baptisms. And they were afraid that the baptisms of these young people was going to detract from the handbells. And yet the life change that had taken place in these high school students and the commitment they were making to following Christ, isn't that the very meaning of Easter for us in the first place? Yeah. Every church, even Glenmar Church, has traditions. And we can get attached to these traditions, and they can be very meaningful to us, and they're not bad. But the problem becomes when we become so preoccupied in preserving the traditions that we miss what God wants to do in our midst, and we forget that the traditions were never meant to be an end in themselves. God never meant for the law to be an end in itself. Rather, it was an external way of reminding the people that they were to be different, they were to be set apart, and that their hearts were to belong to God and nobody else. The other thing the law did was that it taught them what it meant to love their neighbors. And if we just take a look at the 10 Commandments, I think we've got a slide of those. If you look at the 10 Commandments, you can see that they are very clearly divided. The first 4 commandments actually all pertain to what it means and what it looks like to love God. And then the next 6 commandments all talk about how to love others, how to love your neighbors. Now, what Jesus says is that by making these external practices and traditions the main thing, the scribes and the Pharisees were actually abandoning the law of God. More generally, what they were doing was they were neglecting to love God and to love their neighbors. But because these scribes and Pharisees were such sticklers for the law, he actually had to bring out a specific example. And so what he does is he takes the tradition of declaring something korban. Korban is just an Aramaic word meaning offering. And what they would do was they would declare, it didn't matter, money or the produce of their land, they would declare it korban, and that meant that it was set aside for temple use only. And it could be used for no other purpose. And what Jesus says is that that tradition actually contradicts God's commandment to honor your father and mother. And now, if there are young people here and you're with your parents, parents might want to do a little of this on them, because I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about what honoring your father actually meant. And when I was a kid, my parents used to always pull out this commandment whenever they wanted me to listen to what they had to say. Okay, I think some of us can relate to that. But actually, when we consider that the 10 Commandments were given to a group of adults, and likely a group of adult males, because the commandments are all written in the masculine singular, and also under the "you shall not covet," it actually says you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. So when we consider that these commandments were given to a group of adults, the commandment to honor your father and your mother actually takes on an entirely different meaning. It doesn't mean that you would listen to them, but what it means is to take care of your aging parents. And that actually is a theme that runs throughout the commandments. Take care of your aging parents. Take care of the vulnerable in your community. And so by practicing this tradition of declaring things korban, what they were doing was they were setting aside the produce of their land for temple use only, so that they were not able to use it to care for their parents. And Jesus says, this is just one example among many. He's just getting started. So now, before we stick our Bibles back on the shelf and just write this passage off as something that tells us not to get too attached to our church traditions, and that is in there, Jesus' criticism of the scribes and Pharisees is actually meant to point to a larger issue that he was trying to get at. And that's that it's possible for us to spend so much time concerned with the things that give us the appearance of devotion to God that we neglect the interior things. We focus on the exterior and we neglect the interior things, our love for God and our love for other people. And those are the things that God is most concerned with. The traditions of the elders really were just one layer on top of a way of practicing faith that was already very distorted. Now, if you look back at verse 6, Jesus calls the scribes and the Pharisees hypocrites. And it's not a word that we are very fond of, and it's actually a word we hear flying around a lot these days because it's election season. And also, it's sometimes used to describe Christians. And we tend to think that the word hypocrite means someone who says one thing and does another. But actually, the word hypocrite, in its Greek form, and it was a Greek word, and Jesus would have been speaking about it in Greek. In classical Greek, a hypocrite was the word given to describe an actor on a stage. It was someone who played the part or took on the appearance of someone they weren't. And so in their conscientious observance of the laws and of the traditions, the Pharisees played the part of the people and took on the appearance of a people who were very holy and pious. And in fact, they did it so well, they probably could have won an Academy Award. They put on the appearance of holiness, when in reality, their hearts weren't set apart for God at all. And here's why. Jesus says purity comes from within. Since this whole controversy started with a critique of the way that Jesus and his disciples were eating, he actually pulls out a law that has to do with eating as well. What sorts of foods are clean and what sorts of foods are unclean. And in doing this, he actually employs a little bathroom humor. Again, parents, if you don't want your kids doing that, okay? Jesus was the pioneer of potty humor. I don't know if you realize this, but what he does is he uses a parable about bodily functions, which, ironically enough, is probably the most universally understood parable in all of the Gospels. And he uses that to make his point. He says it's not what goes into a person that makes him or her unclean. It's all those gross things that come out of them. Now, don't you think that babies would be so much nicer if they always smelled like they did after they took a bath and they didn't leak from everywhere? I do. In other words, Jesus is saying you shouldn't be so concerned with these external categories of what is clean and unclean if you're not also concerned with the cleanliness of your own heart. God doesn't want a people who practice their faith in appearance only. God wants our hearts. And that's a trap that every Christian is tempted to fall into at some point or another. It is so easy for us to put on the outside appearance of holiness and the outward appearance of faithfulness while still neglecting the things that are inside. We give out these Choose Love bumper magnets, and I think we may have that's my car. So we give these out, and when I put that on my car, I have to confess, I felt a little more Christian. But does having one of these on my car actually help me to love God or love my neighbors anymore? No, I mean, not really. I mean, it may tweak my conscience a little bit so that when I'm driving down 29, I don't maniacally pass someone who's driving too cautiously. And then there's the added thing where I'm always afraid that it's going to be one of you. So I'm a much better driver because of this magnet. But those things, those decisions actually come out of fear. They come out of guilt and not from a heart that is full of love. We have the outward appearance of faith when we put on bumper magnets on our cars, or when we wear a cross, or when we put on a mission trip t-shirt. And there's nothing wrong with these things. And like the law, they can even be reminders to us that we're supposed to be different, that our hearts and our lives are supposed to be set apart for God's purposes. But the problem becomes when we honor God with our lips, or with our jewelry or our clothing or even our traditions and our practices. But our hearts remain far from God. Even when we go to church, or even when we sing in the choir or serve as an usher, we're still at risk of falling into the trap that the scribes and the Pharisees have fallen into. And that's having the outward appearance of faith, but not the heart that's full of love that God so desires from us. One of my relatives told me a story about growing up. He had 4 other brothers and sisters, and every Sunday morning, his parents would have them line up in the driveway to inspect them in their church clothes. Maybe some of you can relate to this, but they did it where all of their neighbors could see. And then they would file neatly into his father's Buick, and they would drive to church. And so on the outside, they had all of the appearance of being a faithful Christian family. They went to church. They served at church. They put their kids through confirmation. But on the inside, the story was a little bit different. And when I asked him about his faith growing up, he said, "We never talked about faith at home." No one ever taught him, either by what they said or what they did, that the most important thing he could do in his life would be to love God and love God's people. And in this episode here in Mark, Jesus gives us a window into the heart of God. And it's as if we can hear God saying, "I don't care how many mission trip t-shirts you have. I don't care how many times you've signed the red attendance pad. I don't care what's on the back of your car. And you know what? I don't even care how much you know me. Do you love me? And will you love me with all your heart and with all your mind and all your soul and all your strength? And in loving me, will you love my people? Will you care for the vulnerable? Will you welcome the outcast? And will you celebrate with me when a teenager chooses to turn from a life of self-destructive behavior and chooses instead to follow Christ?" Where's your heart today? What's inside? We've been created and called to be a holy people, a people set apart. And ultimately, it's not what we wear, it's not the traditions we keep, or how well we appear to have this faith thing all together. But it's the things that are in here that will ultimately set us apart. It's our love for God, and it's our love for other people. Amen? Amen.